My adopted son wanted to find his birth parents, and I supported him every step of the way. What we uncovered in that search shattered everything we thought we knew about love, sacrifice, and the lengths people will go to protect those they care about. The truth wasn't just heartbreaking, it was terrifying. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, delivered by regular mail with no return address. My son Ethan held it in his hands like it contained explosives, which in a way, it did. He was 17 years old, standing in our kitchen with afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and I could see the war happening behind his eyes. He wanted to open it. He was terrified to open it. This envelope contained the results from the DNA ancestry test he'd ordered 3 months earlier, against my initial hesitation but with my eventual support. Inside those pages were potentially the first real clues to finding his birth parents, the people who had given him up for adoption when he was just 3 days old. I watched my son's hands tremble slightly as he turned the envelope over and over, and I felt my heart crack just a little bit more. People always ask adoptive parents if they're afraid their children will love their birth parents more. They ask it delicately, dancing around the question, but that's what they want to know. The truth is far more complicated than that simple fear. I wasn't afraid Ethan would love someone else more. I was afraid of what he might find. I was afraid of the questions that had kept me awake for 17 years, the ones I'd buried deep because there was no good way to answer them. My name is Diane Foster, and my husband Rick and I adopted Ethan through a private agency in Portland, Oregon, back in 2007. We'd been trying to have children for 6 years at that point, enduring 3 miscarriages and countless failed fertility treatments that had drained our savings and nearly destroyed our marriage. When the adoption agency called to tell us about a newborn boy who needed a home, we drove to the hospital that same night. I held him for the first time when he was less than 12 hours old, this tiny perfect human with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. The adoption was closed, meaning we had no contact with the birth parents and very limited information about them. What we did know came from a single page of medical history. Birth mother was 19 years old, Caucasian, healthy. Birth father's information was listed as unknown. No family medical history beyond that. No names, no photos, no story about why they'd made this choice. Just a baby who became ours legally and completely, and a past that existed somewhere in sealed records we were told we'd never be able to access. For 16 years, that was enough. Ethan grew up knowing he was adopted. We never hid it from him, never made it a shameful secret. We had books about adoption on his shelves when he was little, age-appropriate conversations as he got older. He seemed content with his story, or at least he never pushed for more. He had his life, his friends, his plans for college. We were a family, complete and happy in all the ways that mattered. Then he turned 17, and something shifted. It started small. I'd catch him staring at his reflection in the mirror, studying his features like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He'd ask seemingly random questions about genetics, about inherited traits, about whether personality was nature or nurture. Rick and I are both blonde with blue eyes, medium build, naturally athletic. Ethan has dark brown hair that's almost black, hazel eyes that shift between green and brown depending on the light, and a lanky frame that shot up to 6'2" seemingly overnight. He doesn't look like us, and for the first time in his life, that seemed to matter to him. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening in December. Ethan came into the living room where Rick and I were reading, sat down on the ottoman in front of us, and said the words I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "Mom, Dad, I want to find my birth parents. Not because I don't love you, not because you're not enough. I just need to know where I come from. I need to see faces that might look like mine. I need answers to questions I can't even put into words yet." Rick's instinct was to say no, to protect our family from whatever might come from opening this door. But I looked at our son, really looked at him, and saw someone standing at the edge of adulthood with a fundamental question about his own identity. How could we deny him that? How could we say our fear mattered more than his need to know himself fully? So we said yes, but we said it with conditions. We'd do this together, as a family. We'd be careful, methodical, prepared for whatever we might find. And we'd remember that biology doesn't define family, that the people who raise you are your real parents regardless of DNA. Ethan agreed to all of it, relief and anxiety warring on his face. We started with the adoption agency, but hit an immediate wall. The records were sealed, and Oregon's adoption laws at the time meant they would stay that way unless the birth parents had filed consent to be contacted. We checked. They hadn't. The agency couldn't even confirm if they were still in Oregon, still alive, still using the same names. It was a dead end wrapped in legal red tape and privacy protections. That's when Ethan suggested the DNA test. He'd been researching it for months, apparently, reading about adoptees who'd found biological relatives through ancestry databases. You send in a cheek swab, they analyze your DNA, and if anyone related to you has also taken the test, you can connect with them. It seemed like a long shot, but it was the only shot we had. I signed the parental consent form, Rick wrote the check, and we sent off Ethan's DNA sample to a lab in California on a cold January morning. The waiting was excruciating. 12 weeks for results, the website said, though it could be faster. Every day Ethan would check his email, hoping for the notification that his results were ready. Every day I'd watch him check and feel the weight of what we'd set in motion. Rick withdrew a bit during this time, spending longer hours at his accounting firm, coming home tired and quiet. I knew he was struggling with this, feeling like we were helping our son leave us somehow. But I also knew we didn't really have a choice. Ethan was going to search for his past with or without our help, and I'd rather be part of it than shut out of it. My best friend Lauren thought I was being too accommodating. We'd known each other since college, lived 3 blocks apart, knew each other's lives inside and out. She'd been there through all the fertility struggles, had held my hand through the adoption process, loved Ethan like he was her own nephew. But she couldn't understand why we were encouraging this search. What if his birth parents are terrible people, she'd said over coffee one morning while Ethan was at school. What if they're drug addicts or criminals or just people who will hurt him by rejecting him again? What if you find them and wish you hadn't? I didn't have good answers to those questions. All I could say was that Ethan deserved to know his own story, whatever that story turned out to be. Lauren had squeezed my hand across the table and told me I was either the bravest mother she knew or the most foolish, and she wasn't sure which. Maybe both, I'd replied. Probably both. The envelope with the results arrived on a Tuesday, March 20th, exactly 11 weeks after we'd sent the sample. Ethan got home from school, found it in the mailbox, and brought it inside with his hands shaking. Rick was still at work, wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. Ethan looked at me, then at the envelope, then back at me. "Should we wait for Dad?" he asked. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the way it still did sometimes even though it had mostly finished changing. I called Rick at the office. He said he'd leave immediately, be home in 30 minutes if traffic cooperated. Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table with the unopened envelope between us, neither of us speaking. I made tea that neither of us drank. I reorganized the fruit bowl twice. Ethan tapped out a rhythm on the table with his fingers, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath along with us. Rick came through the door 27 minutes later, loosening his tie as he walked. He'd obviously rushed, his normally composed demeanor slightly frazzled. He sat down at the table with us, reached over to squeeze Ethan's shoulder, then nodded. "Whatever you find in there," he said, "you're still our son. Nothing changes that." Ethan's eyes got bright with unshed tears, and he nodded back. He opened the envelope carefully, sliding a letter opener under the flap rather than tearing it. Inside was a multi-page report, dense with scientific terminology and percentage breakdowns. Ethan scanned through the ancestry information quickly, barely glancing at the pie charts showing his ethnic background. What he was looking for was on the last page, in a section labeled DNA relatives. This was the list of people in the database who shared significant amounts of DNA with him, people who were likely biological family members. The list was short. 2 matches. The first was listed as a predicted second cousin, someone named Christopher Whitmore who shared 1.7% of Ethan's DNA. The profile was sparse, just a name and a location in Tacoma, Washington, with no photo and no family tree attached. The second match was closer, much closer. Predicted half-sibling or grandparent, sharing 24.3% of DNA. The profile name was Natalie V., location listed as Seattle, Washington. There was a photo this time, a small thumbnail image that was hard to make out clearly on the printed page. Ethan stared at that second entry like it held all the secrets of the universe. 24%, he whispered. That's close. That's really close. Rick pulled out his phone and started Googling what the different percentage ranges meant for relationships. A half-sibling shares about 25%, he read aloud. A grandparent also shares about 25%. An aunt or uncle shares the same amount. So this person is definitely close family, but we don't know exactly how yet. Could be my birth mother, Ethan said quietly. Could be her mother. Could be a sister I didn't know I had. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His voice was full of wonder and fear and desperate hope. Can we message her? Can we find out who she is? The testing service had a built-in messaging system, Rick discovered, that would let Ethan contact his DNA matches while keeping everyone's personal information private until they chose to share it. You could send a message through the platform without revealing email addresses or phone numbers, a way to reach out safely. Ethan wanted to message her immediately, but I convinced him to wait until morning, to sleep on it and craft something thoughtful rather than desperate. We spent the rest of that evening together, looking up the science of DNA matching, talking through possibilities, trying to manage expectations. What if she doesn't respond? Rick kept saying. What if she doesn't want contact? What if she took this test not knowing she might match with a child given up for adoption? We have to be prepared for rejection. But I saw the light in Ethan's eyes, the hope that had been building for months finally given something concrete to focus on. I knew that whatever happened next, whatever we discovered, there was no going back from this moment. We'd crossed a threshold, and our family would never be quite the same again. I wasn't sure if that terrified me or thrilled me. Maybe both. Probably both. That night I lay awake long after Rick had fallen asleep beside me, staring at the ceiling and wondering about Natalie V. in Seattle. Who was she? Was she Ethan's birth mother, barely older than he was now when she'd given him up? Was she a grandmother who'd been there when that decision was made? Was she angry about being contacted, or had she been waiting 17 years for this message to come? My mind spun through scenarios, each one more elaborate than the last. Around 2 a.m. I got up and went downstairs, intending to make chamomile tea and try to calm my racing thoughts. I found Ethan already in the kitchen, his laptop open on the table, the glow of the screen illuminating his face in the darkness. He looked up when I came in, guilty and defiant at once. I couldn't sleep, he said. I've been drafting the message. Do you want to read it before I send it? I sat down next to him and read what he'd written. It was perfect, really. Honest without being desperate, curious without being demanding. He explained that he was adopted, that he was searching for information about his biological family, that he understood if she wasn't comfortable responding but hoped she might be willing to answer a few questions. He signed it just Ethan, keeping our last name private for now. Good, I told him. That's really good. Are you ready to send it? He looked at me, and in that moment I saw both the toddler who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms and the young man he was becoming, someone capable of facing hard truths and uncertain futures. I'm terrified, he admitted. But I have to know. I have to try. I nodded and watched as he moved the cursor over the send button, hesitated for just a moment, then clicked. The message disappeared from the screen, sent into the digital void, carrying with it all our hopes and fears about what might come next. We didn't have to wait long for an answer. The response came the very next morning, less than 12 hours after Ethan had sent his message. I was making breakfast when Ethan's phone chimed with a notification. He grabbed it so fast he nearly knocked over his orange juice, his eyes scanning the screen rapidly. His face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She responded. "She wants to talk. She thinks she might be my birth mother's sister. She says there's a lot I need to know." Rick came into the kitchen then, drawn by something in Ethan's voice. "What's happening?" he asked, and Ethan just held out his phone, letting us read the message for ourselves. The response was longer than Ethan's original message, and every word felt weighted with meaning. Natalie V had explained that yes, she believed she might be Ethan's biological aunt, that her younger sister had given up a baby boy for adoption in Portland 17 years ago, in the spring of 2007. She said there were circumstances surrounding the adoption that were complicated and painful, things that her sister had never fully recovered from. She said she'd been hoping for years that the child might reach out someday, wanting to know where he came from. And then she wrote something that made my blood run cold. "Before we go any further," she'd written, "you need to understand that finding us might not give you the happy reunion you're hoping for. Your story, your origins, they're darker than you probably imagine. Your birth mother made the hardest choice of her life when she gave you up, and she did it to keep you safe. If you want to proceed, if you really want to know why you were adopted, I'll tell you everything. But once you know, you can't unknow it. Some truths change you forever." Ethan looked up from the phone, his face a mixture of determination and fear. "I want to know," he said firmly. "Whatever it is, I can handle it. I want to know the truth." Rick and I exchanged a glance, one of those wordless conversations married couples develop over years together. We were both thinking the same thing. What had we stumbled into? What darkness was this woman hinting at? And were we really ready to expose our son to whatever secrets lay buried in his past? But looking at Ethan, seeing the set of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes despite his fear, I knew we didn't have the right to stop him now. He deserved his truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. So I took a deep breath and nodded. "Then let's find out," I said. "Let's learn your story. Together." Ethan responded to Natalie within the hour, his message brief but resolute. He wrote that he understood there might be difficult truths ahead, but that he'd spent 17 years not knowing where he came from, and any answer was better than the silence he'd lived with. He gave her his phone number and asked if they could arrange a call. Rick and I sat with him as he typed, neither of us trying to influence his words but both of us needing to be present for this moment. When he hit send, the three of us just sat there in the kitchen, the breakfast I'd made growing cold on plates no one had touched. Natalie called that same afternoon. Ethan had his phone on speaker so Rick and I could hear, the three of us huddled around the device on our dining room table like it was a campfire in the wilderness. The voice that came through was warm but strained, like someone trying to sound calm while barely holding themselves together. "Hello, Ethan," she said, and there was a catch in her voice on his name. "I've thought about this call for 17 years. I never thought it would actually happen." Over the next hour, Natalie told us a story that started to reshape everything we thought we knew about Ethan's adoption. Her sister's name was Christine, she said, though back then everyone called her Chrissy. In the spring of 2007, Christine had been 19 years old, a sophomore at Portland State University studying elementary education. She'd been a good student, responsible, the kind of daughter parents brag about to their friends. She'd had her whole life mapped out, Natalie told us. She wanted to teach third grade. She wanted to get married eventually, have a family, live a normal, happy life. Then she met Derek Vaughn at a party in February of that year. He was older, 26, charming in a way that 19-year-old girls found irresistible. He had money, or at least he acted like he did. Nice car, nice clothes, always picking up the check. Christine was flattered by his attention. She'd never had a serious boyfriend before, had always been too focused on school. Derek made her feel special, sophisticated, like she was more mature than her friends who were still dating boys their own age. They'd been together less than 3 weeks when Christine discovered she was pregnant. Natalie's voice got quieter as she told this part, like the words hurt to say out loud. Chrissy was terrified. She knew Derek would be angry. He'd told her he never wanted kids, that he'd had a vasectomy years ago so he wouldn't have to worry about it. When Christine told him she was pregnant, he accused her of cheating, said there was no way the baby was his. She tried to explain that vasectomies can fail sometimes, that it was rare but possible, but he wouldn't listen. That's when Derek's real personality started to show. The charm disappeared, replaced by something cold and controlling. He told Christine she needed to get an abortion immediately, that if she didn't, he'd make sure everyone knew she was a liar and a cheat. He showed up at her dorm room at all hours, sometimes drunk, sometimes just angry. He called her constantly, leaving increasingly threatening voicemails. He found out where her classes were and would be waiting outside when they ended, demanding to talk to her, to know why she was ruining his life. Christine was falling apart. Her grades started slipping. She stopped going out with friends. Natalie said she barely recognized her sister during those weeks. The light had gone out of her eyes. She was jumpy, anxious, looking over her shoulder constantly. When Natalie finally got Christine to open up about what was happening, she was horrified. She wanted Christine to go to the police, to file a restraining order, but Christine was afraid that would only make things worse. By the time Christine was 4 months pregnant, she'd made the decision to give the baby up for adoption. It wasn't what she wanted, Natalie emphasized. Christine had wanted to keep her baby. But Derek had made it clear that he would never leave her alone as long as that child existed in her life. He'd threatened to take the baby from her the moment it was born, to claim parental rights and make her life hell through custody battles. He'd threatened to hurt her, to hurt the baby, to make sure neither of them ever had a moment of peace. So Christine did what she thought would keep her baby safest. She went through a private adoption agency, chose a family who seemed loving and stable, and signed papers that would seal the adoption records permanently. She told Derek she'd had an abortion, showed him forged medical documents that Natalie had helped her create. For a few weeks, it seemed like it had worked. Derek left her alone. Christine thought she was free. The baby was born on March 15, 2007. Christine held him for 3 hours before the adoptive parents arrived at the hospital. Natalie was there, she told us, her voice breaking. She watched her sister memorize that baby's face, counting his fingers and toes, whispering promises about the good life he was going to have with his new family. When the social worker came to take him, Christine had kissed his forehead one last time and handed him over. Then she'd turned her face to the wall and cried until she had nothing left. Ethan was completely still as he listened to this, his face unreadable. Rick had his hand on our son's shoulder, and I could see his knuckles were white from gripping too hard. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air in the room had gotten too thick. This was our son's origin story, and it was so much darker than any of us had imagined. But Natalie wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the adoption was finalized, Derek figured out that Christine had lied to him. Natalie didn't know how he discovered the truth. Maybe he'd followed Christine to the hospital, maybe he'd paid someone for information. However he found out, he was furious. He showed up at Christine's dorm in the middle of the night, kicked in her door, and beat her so badly she spent a week in the hospital. Broken ribs, fractured eye socket, internal bleeding. The police arrested him, charged him with assault and breaking and entering. Christine got a restraining order then, finally. But restraining orders are just pieces of paper, and Derek Vaughn was the kind of man who didn't care about rules. He made bail within 48 hours and immediately started looking for information about the baby. He went to the adoption agency demanding records. He hired a lawyer to try to undo the adoption. He claimed his parental rights had been violated, that he'd never consented to the adoption. The agency's lawyers fought him. The adoption had been legal since the birth father was listed as unknown on all the paperwork, but Derek kept pushing. That's when things got really terrifying. Derek became obsessed with finding the baby, with finding the family who'd adopted him. He started stalking social workers from the agency. He showed up at family court hearings for other cases, trying to figure out how sealed adoptions worked, looking for loopholes. He posted messages online offering money for information about private adoptions that had happened in Portland in March 2007. He was hunting, Natalie said, and everyone involved with the adoption knew it. The agency did something they'd never done before. They reached out to Christine and told her they were worried about the safety of the child and the adoptive family. They asked if Derek had any way of knowing which family had adopted the baby. Christine couldn't be sure. Derek had been following her for months before the birth. He might have seen her meeting with potential adoptive families. He might have gotten information somehow. The agency made a decision then. They contacted the adoptive family through their lawyer and told them about Derek, about the threats, about the stalking. They recommended the family take precautions. Ethan's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "That was us," he said. "You're talking about us. Did we know? Did my parents know about this guy?" Natalie's silence was answer enough. Rick's face had gone pale. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a memory trying to surface. The agency had told us something after the adoption was finalized. There'd been a meeting with a lawyer, papers to sign. What had they said? What had we been told? Natalie continued. Derek's legal attempts to undo the adoption failed. The court sided with the agency, ruled that the adoption was final and that Derek had no parental rights since Christine had legally listed the father as unknown. But Derek didn't stop. If anything, the court ruling made him angrier. He violated his restraining order 3 more times, each time getting arrested and released again. He kept searching for any trace of where the baby had gone. Then in August of 2007, 5 months after Ethan was born, Derek's car was found at the bottom of a ravine off Highway 26 near Mount Hood. He'd apparently lost control on a curve, crashed through a guardrail, and plunged 200 feet down the mountainside. The car had caught fire. Derek's body was burned beyond recognition, identified only through dental records. The police ruled it an accident. Case closed. The relief Christine felt was immense, Natalie said. For the first time since she'd gotten pregnant, she could breathe without fear. She finished her degree, became a teacher just like she'd planned. She got therapy, learned to manage the trauma. She never dated again, never had other children. Part of her had died when she gave up that baby, Natalie explained, and Derek's violence had destroyed what remained of the carefree girl she'd been. But she built a life for herself. She survived. Except Derek hadn't died in that car accident. Natalie's voice dropped so low we had to strain to hear her. 3 months ago, Christine got a message on social media from an account with no profile picture, no information. The message said, "I found you and I'm coming for what's mine. I know you lied about my son." There was a photo attached, a picture of Christine leaving her apartment. Someone had been watching her. Someone knew where she lived. Christine went to the police immediately, showed them the message. They traced the account but it led nowhere, created with a fake email, routed through international servers. Probably just a prank, the police said. Or maybe an ex-student with a grudge. But Christine knew. Somehow, in a way that defied logic and reason, she knew it was Derek. Either he'd faked his death 17 years ago, or something else equally impossible was happening. Either way, someone was looking for her, and that someone knew about the baby she'd given up. That's when Christine hired a private investigator, a man named Marcus Hayes who specialized in tracking people who didn't want to be found. She told him everything, gave him all the information she had about Derek. The investigator spent 2 months digging, following leads, calling in favors with law enforcement contacts. What he found was impossible, Natalie said, but somehow true. Derek Vaughn had faked his death. The car accident had been staged, the body in the vehicle had been someone else, and Derek had used the confusion and poor record-keeping from 17 years ago to disappear completely. He'd been living under a different name in Seattle, working construction jobs for cash, staying off the grid. For 17 years he'd been patient, waiting, planning. And now he'd decided it was time to finish what he'd started. He wanted to find his biological son. He wanted to punish Christine for lying to him. And he wanted revenge on everyone who'd helped keep him from his child. The private investigator discovered that Derek had been methodically tracking down everyone involved in the adoption. He'd found the names of social workers who'd worked at the agency. He'd located the lawyer who'd represented Christine. He was building a list, and at the top of that list was the adoptive family. He'd been searching adoption records, hacking databases, paying people for information. He was getting close to finding us. That's why Natalie had put her DNA into the ancestry database. She'd been hoping Ethan might test someday, might reach out, so they could warn him and his family. Christine's investigator had advised them that the best defense was to know where Derek was and what he was doing at all times. If Ethan was searching for his biological family, Derek might be monitoring those same databases, looking for any trace of the child who'd been given up. The room was completely silent when Natalie finished talking. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, his face drained of color. Rick had pulled out his phone and was already typing something, probably trying to figure out what to do, who to call. I felt like I was falling, like the floor had disappeared beneath me and I was plunging into darkness. Your birth mother gave you up to save your life, Natalie said quietly. She gave you up so you could grow up safe and loved, away from a man who saw you as property rather than a person. She's spent 17 years hoping you were happy, hoping you were safe, living with a pain that never fully healed. And now that pain is being torn open again because Derek is still out there, still obsessed, still dangerous. What do we do? Ethan whispered. His voice sounded young, scared, nothing like the confident young man who'd opened that DNA test envelope yesterday. How do we stay safe? How do we stop him? Natalie was quiet for a long moment. The investigator has a plan, she finally said. But it's going to require all of us working together. Your adoptive parents, me, Christine, law enforcement. And it's going to require you to be brave, Ethan. Braver than any 17-year-old should have to be. Rick stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane, he said. This is absolutely insane. Our son is in danger from some psychopath who's been presumed dead for nearly 2 decades. And what, we're supposed to just wait around for him to find us? No. No, we're calling the police right now. We're getting protection. We're moving if we have to. The police already know, Natalie said. Christine filed a report. So did the investigator. But Derek hasn't actually done anything illegal yet. Sending an anonymous message isn't enough for an arrest warrant. And if he's been smart enough to stay hidden for 17 years, he's smart enough to avoid getting caught now unless we can draw him out somehow. That's the plan, isn't it? I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, distant. You want to use Ethan as bait. You want Derek to come after him so you can catch him. Natalie didn't deny it. The investigator believes it's the only way, she said. Derek is obsessed with the child. If he knows Ethan is searching for his biological family, if he knows there's a chance for contact, he'll come. And when he does, law enforcement will be ready. Absolutely not, Rick said. There is no universe in which we put our son in danger like that. We'll disappear. We'll change our names. We'll do whatever it takes to keep Ethan safe, but we are not using him as bait for a violent stalker. Ethan spoke then, his voice stronger than before. What if he hurts Christine? What if he hurts other people looking for me? What if the only way to stop him is to face him? We spent the rest of that day in crisis mode. Rick called his brother who was a lawyer, trying to understand our legal options. I called our local police department and filed a report, giving them all the information Natalie had shared. They took it seriously once I mentioned Derek's history of violence and the staged death, but they were honest about their limitations. Without knowing Derek's current identity or location, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in our neighborhood. Lauren came over that evening after I called her, frantic and terrified. She sat with me in the kitchen while Rick and Ethan were upstairs, both of us nursing glasses of wine neither of us really wanted. This is like something from a horror movie, she said. How is this real? How is this your life right now? I didn't have answers. 24 hours ago, my biggest worry was whether Ethan would be disappointed if his biological parents didn't want contact. Now I was worried about whether a violent stalker was going to show up at our door. Natalie sent over the investigators' full report that night. Rick and I read through it after Ethan had gone to bed, though I doubted any of us would actually sleep. The report was thorough and terrifying. Marcus Hayes had traced Derek's movements over the past 17 years, or at least as much as he could piece together. Derek had been careful, very careful, but he'd left traces. A traffic ticket here, a lease agreement there, all under different names but with subtle patterns that linked them together. What became clear from the report was that Derek had never stopped looking for the child. Even while living under false identities, even while maintaining a low profile, he'd been searching. He'd checked adoption registries, monitored social media for any mention of Christine, followed up on any lead no matter how thin. He'd been patient because he believed he had time, but something had changed recently. The investigators' theory was that Derek had learned about DNA testing services and realized they were a new way to find biological relatives. That's why he'd escalated now, sending that message to Christine. He knew that if the child ever took a DNA test, he could potentially find them through relatives who'd also tested. The investigators' plan was detailed in the last section of the report. He proposed setting up a controlled meeting between Ethan and Christine, heavily monitored by law enforcement. They'd let the information about this meeting leak through channels they suspected Derek was monitoring. When Derek showed up, and the investigator was convinced he would, they'd be ready to arrest him. It was risky, the report acknowledged. There were a dozen ways it could go wrong. But the alternative was living in fear indefinitely, always looking over our shoulders, waiting for Derek to strike on his terms rather than ours. Rick closed his laptop and looked at me across the table. "We can't let Ethan do this," he said. "I know he wants to help, I know he feels responsible somehow, but he's our child. Our job is to protect him, not put him in danger." I agreed with Rick in principle, but I also knew our son. Ethan had his father's stubborn determination and my tendency to dig in when faced with injustice. If we said no, if we tried to prevent him from being involved, he'd find a way to do it anyway. At least if we were part of the plan, we could help ensure his safety. We didn't sleep that night. We lay in bed in the darkness, holding hands, listening to the house settle around us. Every creak, every sound made us tense. Rick had checked all the locks 3 times before coming to bed. We'd talked about installing a security system, about getting cameras, about whether we should send Ethan to stay with Rick's parents in California until this was resolved. But sending him away felt like admitting defeat, like giving Derek power over our family even before he'd shown his face. The next morning Ethan came downstairs looking like he'd slept about as much as we had, which was to say not at all. He'd made a decision, he told us. He wanted to meet Christine. He wanted to help with the investigators' plan. He understood the risks, but he also understood that his biological mother had sacrificed everything to keep him safe, and now it was his turn to help keep her safe. "We're in this together," he said. "All of us. That's what family does, right?" Rick and I looked at each other, having one of those wordless conversations. We both knew we'd already lost this argument, that our son had made up his mind and short of locking him in his room, we couldn't stop him. So instead of fighting it, we decided to support it. If this was happening, we'd make damn sure it happened as safely as possible. Rick called the investigator directly that morning. They talked for over an hour, Rick grilling him about every aspect of the plan, demanding contingencies and backup plans and fail-safes. Marcus Hayes was patient with all the questions, professional and thorough in his answers. He'd done this kind of thing before, he assured Rick. He knew how to handle dangerous subjects. He had contacts in local and federal law enforcement. They would keep Ethan safe. The meeting with Christine was scheduled for the following Saturday, 1 week away. It would take place at a small cafe in downtown Portland, public enough that Derek wouldn't risk causing a scene but private enough that they could talk. Plainclothes officers would be stationed throughout the cafe and on the street outside. Marcus Hayes would be at a nearby table. Rick and I would be there too, close enough to intervene if necessary. The meeting itself would seem casual, like a birth mother and her biological son meeting for the first time, nothing that would obviously signal a trap. The investigators' team spent that week preparing. They leaked information carefully, posting vague mentions on adoption reunion forums that they knew Derek had been monitoring. A teenager in Portland searching for his birth mother, hoping for contact, willing to meet. They made it easy for Derek to connect the dots without making it obvious they wanted him to find the information. Bait on a hook, cast into waters where they knew a predator was hunting. Meanwhile, we tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. Ethan went to school, though we started driving him there and back instead of letting him take the bus. Rick worked from home more, never leaving Ethan and me alone in the house for long. Lauren checked in multiple times a day, offering to stay over, to help however she could. We existed in this strange state of heightened alertness, jumping at shadows, seeing threats in every unfamiliar car that drove down our street. Christine sent Ethan a message through Natalie midweek. It was brief but heartfelt. She said she'd thought about him every single day for 17 years. She said giving him up had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but knowing he'd grown up safe and loved had made it bearable. She said she was terrified to meet him, terrified of what he might think of her, but also grateful beyond words for the chance. She signed it simply Mom, though I know you have a real mom already. The woman who raised you and loved you. I'm just the person who gave you life and then gave you away so you could live it. Ethan cried when he read that message. Rick and I held him, this young man who was still our little boy, and let him grieve for all the complicated feelings swirling inside him. He wasn't replacing us by wanting to meet Christine. He was adding to his story, claiming all the pieces of himself. That didn't diminish our role as his parents. If anything, it showed how well we'd raised him, that he had the emotional capacity to hold space for multiple truths at once. Saturday arrived too quickly and not quickly enough. We all dressed carefully that morning, though none of us discussed it. We were trying to look normal, casual, like a family going out for coffee, not like people preparing for a potential confrontation with a violent stalker. Ethan wore jeans and his favorite hoodie. Rick wore khakis and a polo shirt. I chose a simple sweater and slacks, comfortable shoes in case I needed to run. The drive downtown was quiet. Rick's hands were tight on the steering wheel. Ethan stared out the window, watching the city pass by. I kept my phone in my hand, the emergency number for Marcus Hayes already pulled up, ready to call with one touch. We parked 2 blocks from the cafe, as instructed, and walked the rest of the way. It felt surreal, like we were actors in a movie, playing roles in someone else's story. The cafe was small and cozy, the kind of place that served expensive coffee and had mismatched furniture. Christine was already there when we arrived, sitting at a corner table near the window. I recognized her instantly from the family photos Natalie had sent. She had Ethan's eyes, the same hazel color that shifted between green and brown. She had his bone structure, the high cheekbones and strong jaw. She was 36 years old but looked older, worn down by years of trauma and grief. When she saw Ethan, she stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Her hand went to her mouth, and I saw tears already streaming down her face. Ethan walked toward her slowly, and I could see he was shaking. They stood facing each other for a long moment, neither of them knowing quite what to do. Then Christine opened her arms, and Ethan stepped into them, and they held each other while both of them cried. Rick and I hung back, giving them space for this moment while staying close enough to intervene if needed. I scanned the cafe constantly, looking for anything out of place, anyone who seemed too interested in our table. Marcus Hayes was 3 tables over, looking like just another customer reading a newspaper, but I could see his eyes moving methodically around the room. 2 women at the counter were undercover officers, the investigator had told us, though they looked like graduate students getting their morning caffeine fix. Outside on the street, more officers were positioned in unmarked vehicles and on foot, all watching for any sign of Derek Vaughn. Christine and Ethan eventually sat down, still holding hands across the table. Rick and I took seats at the next table, close enough to hear their conversation but trying to give them privacy. Christine couldn't stop looking at Ethan, her eyes drinking in every detail of his face. "You're so tall," she kept saying. "You grew up so tall. And handsome. You look happy. Do you have a happy life?" Ethan assured her that he did, that Rick and I had given him everything a child could want. "Good parents," he said, gesturing to us. "The best parents." Christine looked over at us then, really looked at us for the first time. Thank you, she said, and her voice cracked on the words. Thank you for loving him. Thank you for keeping him safe. Thank you for being everything I couldn't be. I felt tears burning in my own eyes. There was no jealousy in this moment, no competition. Just two mothers, both loving the same child in different ways, both having made impossible sacrifices for his well-being. I reached across and squeezed Christine's hand. You gave him life, I said. That's not nothing. That's everything. They talked for over an hour. Christine told Ethan about her family, his biological family. He had a grandmother who lived in Spokane, an aunt who'd been at the hospital when he was born. He had cousins he'd never met, people who carried the same DNA, the same family traits. Christine showed him photos on her phone, sliding through images of family gatherings and holidays, pointing out relatives and explaining connections. That's your grandfather, she said, showing him an older man with Ethan's same dark hair and strong jawline. He died 5 years ago. He never knew about you. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't tell anyone except Natalie. Ethan absorbed it all, asking questions about medical history, about personality traits, about whether anyone else in the family was tall or good at math or liked the same foods he did. It was the conversation of someone piecing together identity, finding the biological roots that had been missing his whole life. Christine answered everything openly, honestly, holding nothing back. When Ethan asked about Derek, about his biological father, Christine's expression darkened, but she didn't shy away from the truth. Your father was not a good man, she said carefully. I thought he was, at first. He could be charming when he wanted to be. But underneath that charm was someone angry and controlling, someone who saw people as possessions rather than individuals. When I got pregnant with you, his mask came off completely. Everything that happened after that, all the fear and violence and eventual decision to place you for adoption, it all came from him. Does he know about me? Ethan asked. Does he know I exist? Christine glanced at Marcus Hayes, who gave her a small nod. This was the part of the conversation they'd planned, the information they were deliberately sharing in case Derek was watching somehow, listening through means they hadn't detected. Yes, Christine said. He knows. And I need you to understand something, Ethan. Your biological father is dangerous. He's been looking for you for a long time. That's why we have to be so careful right now. That's why there are police here, watching. We think he might try to make contact. Ethan's face paled, but he didn't look surprised. He'd known this was more than just a reunion, that there was danger lurking beneath this meeting. What does he want? Ethan asked. After all these years, what could he possibly want? Christine's expression was pained. Control, she said. Revenge. A chance to hurt me by taking you away from the family who raised you. He's obsessed with the idea that you're his property, that I stole you from him by giving you up for adoption. Logic doesn't apply to someone like Derek. He doesn't think like normal people think. The conversation shifted after that, both of them seeming to need lighter topics. Christine asked about school, about friends, about what Ethan wanted to do after graduation. Ethan told her about his plans to study engineering, about his interest in renewable energy, about the college applications he'd been working on. Christine listened with hungry attention, soaking up details about the life her son had lived without her. Every few minutes she'd say something like, I'm so proud of you, or you turned out so well, and I could see the relief in her eyes that the sacrifice she'd made had resulted in a good outcome. Around the 90-minute mark, Marcus Hayes stood up and stretched, the signal that the meeting needed to start wrapping up. They'd been there long enough. If Derek was coming, he would have made his move by now. The fact that nothing had happened was either good news, meaning he didn't know about the meeting, or bad news, meaning he was being more cautious than they'd anticipated. Either way, staying longer increased risk without increasing benefit. Christine hugged Ethan goodbye, holding on just a few seconds longer than necessary. Can I see you again? She asked. Is that allowed? Would you want that? Ethan looked at Rick and me, checking in without words. We both nodded. Of course, Ethan said. I'd like that. I have a lot more questions. A lifetime of questions, really. Christine smiled through fresh tears. I'll answer every one, she promised. However long it takes. We walked out of the cafe together, Marcus Hayes trailing behind us at a discreet distance. The street outside was busy with Saturday morning foot traffic, people going about their normal lives completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded over coffee and pastries. Our car was still 2 blocks away. The walk felt longer now, every person we passed a potential threat, every vehicle that slowed down a possible danger. We were halfway to the car when I noticed the man. He was standing across the street, leaning against a building, watching us. Something about his posture, the intensity of his stare, made my blood run cold. I grabbed Rick's arm and nodded slightly in the man's direction. Rick followed my gaze and tensed immediately. Marcus Hayes had noticed too. He was already moving, speaking quietly into his phone, alerting the other officers. The man started walking toward us, crossing the street at an angle that would intercept our path. He was in his mid-40s, wearing jeans and a dark jacket, average height and build, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. But there was nothing average about the way he was looking at Ethan. His eyes were locked on our son with an intensity that felt predatory, possessive. Christine saw him and stopped dead in her tracks. Her face drained of color and she made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Derek. After all these years, I'd know those eyes anywhere. That's him." Everything happened very fast after that. Marcus Hayes moved between Derek and our group, his hand inside his jacket where I knew he kept his weapon. The 2 women from the cafe emerged from the doorway behind us, no longer pretending to be students. Police officers materialized from parked cars and doorways, moving to surround Derek from multiple angles. "Stop right there," one of them called out. "Portland Police. We need you to show us your hands." Derek didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. His eyes never left Ethan, and there was something terrible in his expression, something that looked like recognition and rage mixed together. "That's my son," he said loudly. "That's my boy. You people stole him from me. You all conspired to take what's mine." "Sir, you need to stop moving and put your hands where we can see them," another officer commanded, this one with his weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. Derek kept advancing. I reached for Ethan, trying to pull him behind me, but Ethan stood his ground. He was staring at Derek with a mixture of horror and fascination, seeing his biological father for the first time, understanding where half his DNA had come from. "You don't know me," Derek called out to Ethan, his voice carrying across the street. "But I'm your real father. These people poisoned your mother against me. They convinced her to give you away. I've been searching for you for 17 years. 17 years of having my child stolen from me. But I found you. I finally found you." Rick stepped in front of Ethan completely, blocking Derek's view. "You need to leave," Rick said, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he must be feeling. "You need to turn around and walk away right now." Derek laughed, a sound without humor. "Walk away from my own flesh and blood? From the son that woman stole from me? Never. I have rights. I have a claim." The officers were closing in now, hands on their weapons, shouting commands. Derek finally seemed to realize he was surrounded, that there was no path forward. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket and suddenly there were 6 guns pointed at him, officers screaming at him to show his hands, to get on the ground. For a horrible moment I thought he was going to pull a weapon, that this was going to end in gunfire right here on a busy Portland street with my son watching. But what Derek pulled from his pocket wasn't a gun. It was a knife, a long hunting knife with a worn handle. He held it up, not threatening anyone with it but making it visible. "I'll die before I let you keep me from him again," Derek said, and his voice had gone flat, emotionless. "I've lost 17 years. I won't lose another day." Marcus Hayes moved then, faster than I would have thought possible. He closed the distance between himself and Derek in 3 quick steps, using some kind of defensive technique that knocked the knife from Derek's hand and sent it clattering across the pavement. Two officers were on Derek immediately after that, forcing him to the ground, pulling his arms behind his back, securing handcuffs. Derek fought them, screaming about his rights, about his son, about conspiracies and theft and injustice. His voice rose to a howl as they pulled him to his feet and started walking him toward a waiting patrol car. Ethan was shaking. I wrapped my arms around him from behind, holding him close, feeling his heart hammering against my hands. Christine was crying, covering her mouth with both hands. Rick just stood there looking stunned, like he couldn't quite process what had just happened. The whole confrontation had lasted maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like hours had passed. Marcus Hayes came over to us once Derek was secured in the patrol car. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning each of us for injury. We all nodded, though none of us looked okay. "That was him," Hayes confirmed unnecessarily. "Derek Vaughn, also known as David Winters, also known as Daniel Worth. We've been tracking his alternate identities for months. The knife is enough for assault charges, combined with the restraining order violations and the stalking, we have enough to hold him for a long time." "What happens now?" Rick asked. Hayes glanced at the patrol car where Derek was still shouting, his words muffled by the windows. "Now we build the case. He'll be arraigned Monday morning. With his history, the judge will likely deny bail. We'll gather evidence about the staged death, the identity fraud, the years of stalking. The district attorney is confident we can get him locked up for decades." He looked at Ethan then. "You did good, kid. I know that was terrifying, but you helped us catch someone who's been evading justice for 17 years. Ethan didn't respond. He was staring at the patrol car, watching through the window as Derek continued his muted tirade. "That man is half of who I am," Ethan said quietly. "His DNA is part of me. Does that mean I'm like him? Does that mean I could become like him?" Christine moved to Ethan's side, gently turning him to face her. "You are nothing like him," she said firmly. "You have his genetics, yes, but you have my genetics too. More importantly, you have 17 years of being raised by good people. You have values and morals and empathy that Derek never had. DNA doesn't determine who you are. The choices you make determine that." We gave our statements to the police right there on the street, each of us recounting what we'd seen and heard. Other witnesses came forward too, people who'd been shopping or walking by when the confrontation happened, all of them confirming that Derek had been advancing aggressively, that he'd been the one to produce a weapon. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't going to be a he said she said situation. This was going to be a slam-dunk prosecution. By the time we finally made it home that afternoon, we were all emotionally wrung out. Lauren was waiting on our porch, having driven over as soon as I'd texted her that we were safe. She hugged each of us in turn, then herded us inside and made tea no one really wanted but everyone accepted anyway. We sat in the living room, the four of us plus Lauren, processing what had happened in stunned silence. Ethan spoke first. "I saw him," he said. "I saw my biological father and he was completely insane. He was standing there with a knife, screaming about me like I was an object he owned, and all I could think was that my birth mother saved my life. If Christine had kept me, if she'd tried to raise me with that man in our lives, I might not have survived childhood. The adoption wasn't her giving me up. It was her giving me a chance." Christine called later that evening, checking to make sure Ethan was okay. They talked for almost an hour, Ethan on his bed with his door half open so Rick and I could hear if he needed us. I listened to snippets of their conversation, hearing Ethan ask deeper questions now, wanting to understand the full story of his origin. Christine answered everything, holding nothing back, and I was grateful for her honesty even though some of the details made my blood run cold. Over the next few days, the full scope of Derek's activities came to light. The police found a storage unit he'd been renting under one of his false names. Inside were files, so many files. He'd been documenting everything about Christine's life, about the adoption, about possible families who might have adopted a baby in March 2007. He had photos, surveillance notes, copies of public records. He'd narrowed his search down to 7 possible families. We were one of them. Another few weeks and he probably would have found us even without the DNA test connection. The storage unit also contained plans, disturbing detailed plans about what Derek intended to do once he found Ethan. He'd written out scenarios, ways he could approach the adoptive family, ways he could convince or force them to give Ethan back. Some of the scenarios involved legal action, custody battles, claims of parental rights violation. Others involved violence, kidnapping, threats against the adoptive family's safety. Reading the police reports about what they'd found made me physically ill. Derek's arraignment happened Monday morning as scheduled. Rick and I went, wanting to see him formally charged, needing that closure. Christine came too, with Natalie for support. We sat in the gallery while the charges were read out. Identity fraud, stalking, violation of restraining order, assault with a deadly weapon, plus a slew of other charges related to faking his death and living under false identities for 17 years. The prosecutor requested remand without bail, citing Derek as an extreme flight risk and danger to multiple individuals. The judge agreed. Derek was led out of the courtroom in shackles, still protesting his innocence, still claiming he was the victim. Christine testified at a preliminary hearing 2 weeks later. I sat in the courtroom and watched her recount the whole terrible story under oath. The relationship, the pregnancy, the violence, the fear that had driven her to give up her baby. She cried on the stand but she didn't break. She looked Derek right in the eye as she described what he'd done to her, how he'd terrorized her, how she'd lived in fear even after his supposed death. Derek's lawyer tried to paint Christine as vindictive, as a woman who'd stolen his parental rights out of spite. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The hospital records from when Derek had beaten Christine, the restraining orders, the threatening messages, the stalking behavior. The jury would have no trouble seeing who the real victim was. The trial was scheduled for early fall, 6 months away. The prosecutor assured us it would likely be continued, that Derek's lawyer would file every motion and delay they could think of. We might be looking at a year before this fully ended. But for now, Derek was behind bars and would stay there. We could breathe. We could start processing what had happened and figuring out how to move forward. Ethan and Christine developed a relationship over those months, carefully and slowly. They'd meet for coffee every few weeks, always in public places, always with Rick and me nearby. They texted occasionally, sharing photos and updates. Christine came to one of Ethan's baseball games and sat with us in the stands, cheering louder than anyone when Ethan got a hit. It was awkward sometimes, figuring out the boundaries of this relationship, but they were both committed to making it work. One evening in late April, about 2 months after Derek's arrest, Ethan came to Rick and me with something he'd been thinking about. He wanted to meet his biological grandmother, Christine's mother who lived in Spokane. He wanted to meet his Aunt Natalie in person, not just through phone calls. He wanted to connect with the biological family he'd never known he had. Rick and I talked about it and agreed. This was part of Ethan's healing, part of him integrating all the pieces of his identity. We drove to Spokane on a Saturday in May, the 4 of us in our car. Christine met us at her mother's house, a small ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood. Ethan's grandmother, whose name was Patricia, opened the door before we even reached the porch. She stood there looking at Ethan with tears streaming down her face. "I never thought I'd see you," she said. "When Chrissy told me she'd found you, that you wanted to meet me, I thought my heart would burst." Patricia had photos, albums full of family history that she spread across her dining room table. She showed Ethan pictures of his grandfather, who died 5 years earlier never knowing he had a grandson. She showed him photos of Christine as a child, as a teenager, as the young woman who'd gotten pregnant and made the hardest choice of her life. She showed him cousins and uncles and aunts, generations of family stretching back decades. "This is where you come from," she told Ethan. "These are your people, your blood." But she looked at Rick and me too, including us in her gaze. "And these are your people too, the ones who loved you and raised you. You're blessed to have so much family." Natalie was there too, warm and funny in person just like she'd been on the phone. She hugged Ethan tight and told him she'd been praying for this day since he was born. The whole afternoon felt surreal, watching Ethan connect with people who shared his DNA, seeing him find pieces of himself in their faces and mannerisms. He had his grandmother's laugh, loud and unrestrained. He had his grandfather's hands, long-fingered and graceful. He had Christine's way of tilting his head when he was thinking hard about something. But he also had Rick's sense of humor, dry and quick. He had my stubbornness, my tendency to dig in when I believed in something. He had our values, our worldview, our family traditions. He was a blend of nature and nurture, genetics and environment, biological family and chosen family. He belonged to all of us. On the drive home, Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said thank you. Rick asked what for, and Ethan's voice was thick with emotion when he answered. For letting me search. For not being threatened by it. For understanding that wanting to know where I came from didn't mean I loved you less. A lot of parents wouldn't have been that secure. A lot of parents would have tried to stop me or made me choose. You never did that. Rick reached back from the driver's seat and squeezed Ethan's knee. You're our son, he said simply. That means we want what's best for you, even when it's hard for us. Even when it's scary. That's what parents do. I turned around in my seat to look at Ethan. You gave us the gift of being your parents 17 years ago, I said. Nothing that happens now can take that away. Not Derek, not Christine, not anyone. We're family, and family doesn't come with conditions. The trial finally happened in October, almost 8 months after Derek's arrest. It lasted 2 weeks, every day filled with testimony and evidence that painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man who'd been unable to let go of his obsession. The defense tried to argue mental illness, tried to paint Derek as someone who needed treatment rather than punishment. But the prosecution countered with the evidence of calculation, of planning, of years of methodical stalking that showed clear intent and awareness. Christine testified again, this time for a full day. Ethan sat with us in the gallery, watching his birth mother recount the trauma she'd endured. It was hard for him, I could tell, hearing the full details of the violence, understanding the depth of the fear that had driven the adoption. But he was old enough now to process it, mature enough to hold the complexity of the situation. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned with a verdict, every person in that courtroom seemed to be holding their breath. Guilty on all counts. Derek showed no emotion as the verdict was read, just stared straight ahead like he was somewhere else entirely. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the prosecutor told us to expect a significant prison term given the severity and duration of the crimes. Those 3 weeks felt strange, like we were all suspended in time waiting for the final chapter to close. Ethan threw himself into his senior year coursework, working on college applications with a focus I'd never seen before. He wrote his main essay about identity and family, about what it means to be shaped by both genetics and environment. His English teacher called it the most mature piece of writing she'd seen from a high school student in 20 years of teaching. Several of the colleges he applied to specifically commented on the essay when they sent acceptance letters months later. Christine struggled during this waiting period. The trial had forced her to relive her worst memories, to speak publicly about trauma she'd spent 17 years trying to process privately. Natalie called me one evening to say that Christine was having nightmares again, waking up in a panic thinking Derek was breaking into her apartment. We'd all hoped that Derek's arrest would bring relief, but trauma doesn't work that way. Sometimes facing the source of your fear head-on makes it worse before it gets better. Rick and I encouraged Ethan to reach out to Christine during this time, to let her know he was there for her. It seemed important that she see the good that had come from her sacrifice, that she understand her choice to give Ethan up had resulted in a young man capable of compassion and strength. Ethan started calling her twice a week, just to chat about ordinary things. School, weather, the books he was reading. Normal conversation that reminded Christine that life went on, that Derek hadn't won, that there was still joy to be found. Lauren came over for dinner one night in mid-November, bringing wine and homemade lasagna. She'd been our rock through all of this, showing up when we needed her, giving us space when we didn't, always knowing exactly what we required. As we ate, she asked the question I knew had been on her mind for months. How are you really doing with all of this? Not the public answer you give everyone else. The real answer. I thought about it, trying to articulate feelings I'd barely admitted to myself. It was terrifying, I said honestly. Every moment from when we got that first DNA match to when Derek was arrested, I was terrified. Terrified we'd lose Ethan, terrified someone would get hurt, terrified our family would be destroyed. But underneath the fear was something else. Pride, maybe? Pride that Ethan was brave enough to search for his truth. Pride that we'd created a family strong enough to weather this storm. Pride that when tested, we chose love over fear. Rick added his own thoughts. I spent a lot of time being angry, he admitted. Angry at Derek, obviously, but also angry at the situation. Angry that this violent man's actions were still impacting our lives 17 years later. Angry that Ethan's origin story had to include so much darkness. But watching him handle it, watching him extend compassion to Christine while still holding on to us as his parents, I realized he's stronger than I ever gave him credit for. We raised a remarkable kid. Ethan had been listening from the doorway, neither of us aware he'd come downstairs. He walked into the dining room and sat down, reaching across to steal a breadstick from the basket. You guys are remarkable too, he said quietly. I know this wasn't easy for you. I know there were moments when you wanted to stop me from searching, to protect me from what I might find. But you let me do it anyway. You trusted me to handle the truth, whatever it was. That's real love, the kind that lets go even when holding on feels safer. The sentencing hearing arrived on a cold Monday morning in late November. The courtroom was packed, not just with our families but with members of the press who'd been following the case. Derek Vaughn's story had captured public attention in a way none of us had anticipated. The man who faked his own death to stalk his biological son became a cautionary tale about obsession and parental rights, spawning think pieces and debates about adoption laws and the nature of family. The judge heard victim impact statements before announcing the sentence. Christine went first, reading from a prepared statement in a voice that shook but never broke. She talked about the 19-year-old girl she'd been, full of hope and plans, and how Derek had systematically destroyed that girl. She talked about the baby she'd held for 3 hours, memorizing his face because she thought she'd never see him again. She talked about 17 years of grief mixed with relief, always wondering if she'd made the right choice, always hoping he was safe and loved and happy. Then she looked directly at Derek for the first time since the trial had begun. You tried to destroy me, she said. You tried to take everything that mattered. But I survived. My son survived. He grew up into an extraordinary young man despite your attempts to control his existence. You lost. Not just this trial, not just your freedom, but everything you thought you were fighting for. Ethan knows who you are now, and he wants nothing to do with you. That's your legacy. Not fatherhood, but failure. The prosecutor called several other witnesses who'd been impacted by Derek's actions. The social worker who'd processed the adoption and then spent years being stalked by Derek, receiving threatening calls and having her car vandalized. The lawyer who'd represented Christine, who'd had to get his own restraining order after Derek showed up at his office with a baseball bat. Each testimony painted a picture of a man who left destruction in his wake, who hurt anyone who got in the way of his obsession. Rick gave a statement too, something he'd decided to do at the last minute. He talked about what it meant to be a father, the real work of parenting that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with showing up every day. He talked about teaching Ethan to ride a bike, helping with homework, sitting through countless baseball games in all kinds of weather. He talked about the fear he'd felt when Derek had appeared with a knife, not fear for himself but absolute terror at the thought of losing his son to this stranger who claimed ownership based on DNA alone. You contributed genetic material, Rick said, looking at Derek with barely controlled anger. That's all you did. You weren't there for the first steps, the first words, the first day of school. You weren't there for the scraped knees and hurt feelings and growing pains. You weren't there for any of the moments that actually make someone a father. And now you want to claim him? Now you want to act like you have rights? You have nothing. You are nothing to him except a cautionary tale about what happens when violence and obsession go unchecked. I gave a statement as well, though I debated whether to. In the end, I felt I needed to speak, needed to make clear what Derek's actions had cost. I talked about the joy of becoming a mother after years of heartbreak, of holding Ethan for the first time and knowing he was meant to be ours. I talked about watching him grow, celebrating every milestone, loving him with a fierceness I didn't know I possessed. Then I talked about the fear of almost losing him, not to death or illness but to a man who saw him as property rather than person. You taught us something, I said to Derek. You taught us that family isn't about biology. It's about choice, about commitment, about showing up even when it's hard. Christine chose to give Ethan life and then chose to give him the best life she could by placing him for adoption. Rick and I chose to love him as our own from the moment we met him. Ethan chose to search for his origins with courage and maturity. Every step of this story has been about people making choices, good choices based on love. You're the only one who chose violence and obsession. That's why you're standing where you are today. The judge took a brief recess before announcing the sentence, giving everyone time to compose themselves. When court reconvened, the judge spoke at length about the case, about the pattern of behavior spanning nearly 2 decades, about the calculated nature of Derek's actions. Then he handed down the sentence. 45 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 30 years. Derek would be in his mid-70s before he could even apply for release. Derek stood to make a statement then, something he'd refused to do throughout the entire trial. He rambled about injustice, about his rights as a biological father being violated, about a conspiracy to keep him from his child. He insisted he'd only wanted to know his son, to be part of his life, that everyone else had overreacted to his attempts at contact. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Vaughn, the judge said coldly, you faked your own death to avoid accountability. You stalked multiple people for years. You showed up with a knife. This was not a father seeking contact with his child. This was a predator hunting his prey. The sentence stands. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon felt surreal. It was over. Really, truly over. Derek would spend the rest of his functional life in prison, no longer a threat to Christine or Ethan or anyone else. The media was waiting outside, cameras and microphones thrust toward us, shouting questions. Marcus Hayes, who'd been in the courtroom for the sentencing, helped clear a path to our car. The investigator had become a friend through all of this, someone who'd seen us through the worst and helped ensure the best possible outcome. That evening, our extended family gathered at our house. Christine and Natalie came, along with Patricia who'd driven down from Spokane. Lauren was there, of course, along with Rick's brother and his family who'd flown in for the sentencing. Ethan's closest friends came too, the ones who'd supported him through the chaos of the past months. We ordered pizza and sat around talking, the conversation eventually shifting from the trial to lighter topics, to plans for Thanksgiving and Ethan's upcoming 18th birthday. At one point I found Christine standing alone in our kitchen, looking at the photos we had displayed on the refrigerator. Pictures of Ethan through the years, birthday parties and holidays and ordinary moments captured and preserved. She was crying quietly, and I almost didn't intrude, but then she looked up and saw me. I used to imagine this, she said softly. What his childhood looked like, what kind of home he had. I'd make up stories in my head about his birthday parties and his first day of school. She gestured at the photos. This is so much better than anything I imagined. You gave him everything. We gave him love, I said, moving to stand beside her. But you gave him life. You made the hardest choice a mother can make because you knew it was what he needed. That took more courage than I think I could have managed. Christine shook her head. You would have done the same in my position. Any mother would have. We do what we have to do to keep our children safe, even when it breaks our hearts. We stood there together, 2 women bound by the same child, no longer competing but complementing. She was his past, the origin of his story. I was his present, the day-to-day reality of his life. Neither role diminished the other. Both were essential to making Ethan who he was. I thought about all the fear I'd had when this search began, the worry that finding his biological family would somehow lessen our connection. How foolish that seemed now. Love wasn't a finite resource that got used up when shared. It expanded, encompassing more people, creating stronger bonds. Ethan's 18th birthday fell 2 weeks after the sentencing. We threw him a party that was really an excuse for everyone to celebrate survival, to mark not just his entry into legal adulthood but the end of a dark chapter and the beginning of something new. Christine gave him a gift that made everyone cry, a photo album she'd assembled with help from Patricia and Natalie. It contained pictures of his biological family going back generations, relatives he'd never met but whose features echoed in his own face. On the first page was a letter Christine had written, telling Ethan the story of his birth from her perspective, holding nothing back about the fear and love and impossible choices. Rick and I gave him a gift that was more practical, a laptop for college with software he'd need for his engineering program. But we also gave him something more meaningful, a leather-bound journal with a note on the first page. "Your story is yours to write now," we'd written. "You know where you came from, both biologically and through adoption. You know the love that multiple families have for you. Now you get to decide what comes next, who you want to be, what kind of life you want to build. We're proud of the man you're becoming." College acceptance letters started arriving in December and January. Ethan got into several excellent engineering programs, including his top choice at Oregon State University. It was only 2 hours away, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to give him real independence. He'd be living on campus, experiencing all the normal milestones of young adulthood that had almost been derailed by Derek's obsession. The normalcy of it felt precious, hard-won. Christine asked if she could attend Ethan's high school graduation in June. "Of course," we told her. "Your family." The ceremony was outdoors on a warm spring evening, hundreds of seniors in caps and gowns preparing to move into the next phase of their lives. When Ethan's name was called and he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, 3 different sections of the stands erupted in cheers. His friends, loud and enthusiastic. Our family and friends, proud and emotional. And Christine's section, her and Natalie and Patricia, celebrating a moment they'd never been sure they'd witness. After the ceremony, during the chaos of photos and congratulations, Ethan found Christine in the crowd. He hugged her and said thank you. Just that, no elaboration needed. Christine hugged him back, both of them crying, and I saw 17 years of grief and wondering finally transform into something else. Not closure, exactly, because some wounds never fully close. But peace, maybe. Acceptance. The understanding that the painful choice she'd made had resulted in this moment, this young man ready to take on the world, surrounded by people who loved him. The summer passed quickly, filled with preparations for college and lazy days savoring the last months of having Ethan at home full-time. He worked part-time at a local bookstore, saved money, spent time with friends. He visited Christine regularly, sometimes with Rick and me, sometimes on his own. They were building their own relationship now, something separate from his relationship with us, and that felt healthy and right. He was learning to hold complexity, to love multiple people in different ways, to be son and grandson and nephew to an extended family that spanned biological and adoptive lines. In August, we loaded up 2 cars with everything Ethan would need for his dorm room and made the drive to Oregon State. Move-in day was controlled chaos, hundreds of families unloading cars and hauling boxes up narrow stairways. Rick and I had agreed that Christine should be there too, that this was a milestone she deserved to witness. She'd driven up separately and met us in the parking lot, bringing homemade cookies and a care package of practical items Ethan would need. We spent hours setting up his room, hanging posters and organizing closets and making the small space feel like home. Other parents were doing the same, and I watched them with a mixture of empathy and detachment. They were worried about normal things, whether their kids would make friends, whether they'd remember to do laundry. We'd worried about those things too, but we'd also worried about violent stalkers and biological fathers showing up with knives. It gave everything a different perspective. When it was time to leave, when Ethan walked us back to the parking lot for goodbyes, I found myself surprisingly calm. I'd expected to be a mess, crying and clinging, dreading the empty nest. But instead I felt grateful. Grateful we'd made it here, that all the fear and uncertainty of the past year hadn't derailed this moment. Grateful that Ethan was safe and happy and ready for independence. Grateful that I'd get to be his mother for his whole life, not just his childhood, that our relationship would evolve and grow as he did. Rick hugged Ethan hard, doing that masculine thing where they pounded each other's backs and tried not to show too much emotion. "Be good," Rick said. "Call if you need anything. We'll come down for Parents' Weekend." I hugged him next, letting myself hold on a little longer, breathing in the smell of his cologne and memorizing the moment. "I love you," I said. "I'm so proud of you. Thank you for letting me be your mom." Christine's goodbye was longer, more emotional. She held Ethan's face in her hands and looked at him like she was trying to memorize his features all over again. "You're going to do amazing things," she told him. "You're going to change the world. I wish I could take credit for that, but I can't. All I did was give you life. Your parents gave you everything else. But I want you to know that I'll always be here. If you need me, if you want to talk, if you just want someone who understands where you came from, I'm here." We watched him walk back into his dorm, waving one last time before disappearing inside. The three of us stood there in the parking lot, bound by this young man we all loved, each of us having played our part in getting him to this moment. Then we hugged, the three of us together, and it didn't feel strange or forced. It felt right. We were all Ethan's family, different branches of the same tree, and that was okay. That was exactly how it should be. On the drive home, Rick and I held hands across the center console and didn't talk much. We were both processing the same things, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Our house would be quieter now, missing Ethan's presence, his laughter, his music playing too loud from his room. But it would also be peaceful in a way it hadn't been for a year, no longer shadowed by fear and uncertainty. That night, lying in bed, I thought about everything that had happened since that Tuesday afternoon in March when Ethan had opened an envelope and changed all our lives. The DNA test, the messages with Natalie, the meeting with Christine, Derek's appearance and arrest, the trial and sentencing. So much drama and fear and intensity packed into 1 year. But underneath all of that had been love. Christine's love for the child she gave up. Our love for the son we'd raised. Ethan's love for all of us, big enough to encompass the complexity of his dual heritage. Rick's voice came out of the darkness beside me. "We did okay, didn't we? Raising him, handling the search, surviving Derek. We did okay." I squeezed his hand. "We did better than okay," I said. "We created a family strong enough to withstand anything. We raised a son who's brave and kind and capable of holding nuance. We opened our hearts when it would have been easier to close them. Yeah, we did more than okay." Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. The next morning I woke to sunshine streaming through the windows and the knowledge that Derek was in prison, Christine was healing, and Ethan was starting his college adventure. The fear that had dominated so much of our year was finally, truly gone. What remained was gratitude for the family we'd built, the challenges we'd overcome, and the future stretching out before us full of possibility instead of threat. Lauren called late morning, checking in like she always did. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Empty nest hitting you hard?" I thought about it, trying to articulate the mix of emotions. "It's strange," I admitted. "The house feels too quiet. But mostly I just feel relieved. We made it through. Ethan's safe, Derek's locked up, Christine has peace. We survived the worst thing I could imagine, and we came out stronger. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Lauren said firmly. "You're allowed to be proud, Diane. You're allowed to feel like you won. Because you did. All of you did." We talked for another hour about nothing important, just the comfortable conversation of old friends. When we hung up, I realized she was right. We had won. Not by destroying Derek, though that had happened. Not by excluding Christine, though we could have chosen that path. We'd won by choosing love and inclusion and bravery in the face of fear. That was the real victory. Christine sent a text that afternoon with a photo attached. She'd been going through old boxes at her mother's house and found a baby blanket, pale blue with yellow ducks, that she'd bought when she was pregnant. She'd never given it to Ethan, had packed it away when she signed the adoption papers. The text read, "I'm sending this to him at college. He should have something from those first days, even if it's just a blanket. I want him to know he was loved from the very beginning, before he even had a name. I replied immediately. That's beautiful. He'll treasure it. And he does know, Christine. He knows how much you loved him, how hard your choice was. You gave him the best gift a mother can give, the chance at a safe and happy life. Thank you for that. Thank you for trusting us with him. We tried to be worthy of that trust. Her response came quickly. You were more than worthy. You were perfect. I couldn't have chosen better parents for him if I'd met you directly instead of going through the agency. Everything I hoped for him came true because of you and Rick. That's not something I can ever repay, but I want you to know I recognize it. I see you. I appreciate you. And I'm grateful every single day that my son had you. Tears streamed down my face as I read her words. For so long I'd been afraid of Christine, afraid she'd want to reclaim Ethan, afraid her biological connection would be more powerful than our emotional one. How wrong I'd been. How much time I'd wasted on fear when I could have trusted in the strength of the bonds we'd built. Ethan was ours not because of legal documents or genetics, but because of years of daily love and presence and commitment. Nothing could change that, certainly not a birth mother who only wanted what was best for him too. The months that followed settled into a new rhythm. Ethan called regularly from college, sometimes to share exciting news about his classes or new friends, sometimes just to chat about nothing important. He came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, filling the house with his presence and energy before heading back to campus. He visited Christine during those breaks too, having coffee or dinner, continuing to build their relationship at a pace that felt comfortable for both of them. Derek remained in prison, as he would for decades to come. Occasionally his name would come up in the news when he filed another appeal or claimed his rights had been violated. Each appeal was denied, each claim dismissed. He'd become a footnote in our lives, no longer a source of fear but simply a dark part of Ethan's origin story, something that had happened but no longer had power over the present. 2 years have passed since that Tuesday afternoon when Ethan opened the DNA test results that changed everything. He's 19 now, finishing his sophomore year at Oregon State with a stellar grade point average and a summer internship lined up at a renewable energy company in Seattle. He's grown into himself in ways I never could have predicted, confident and thoughtful and remarkably well-adjusted considering everything he's been through. The relationship between our families has evolved into something beautiful and unexpected. Christine is part of our lives now, not as a threat or a replacement but as an addition. She comes to family dinners sometimes, joins us for holiday celebrations, shows up at Ethan's events when he wants her there. Patricia and Natalie have become friends with Rick and me, bonding over shared love for Ethan and shared relief that the nightmare is over. We've created something new, a blended family that doesn't fit traditional definitions but works perfectly for us. Ethan has grown closer to Christine over these 2 years, understanding her better as he's matured. He told me once that meeting her helped him understand himself in ways he hadn't expected. Not just the physical traits he inherited or the medical history he'd been curious about, but deeper things. The way she thinks, her mannerisms, her approach to problem solving. He sees pieces of himself reflected in her, and that connection has given him a sense of completeness he didn't know he was missing. But he's also clear about who his real parents are. Rick and I raised him, shaped him, gave him the foundation he stands on. Christine gave him life and then gave him to us, the ultimate act of maternal love. Both truths exist simultaneously without contradiction. He doesn't have to choose between us because we're not asking him to. We all chose him, and that's what matters. The adoption story has changed me too, in ways I'm still discovering. I'm less afraid now, less inclined to hold on too tightly out of fear of losing what I love. I've learned that opening your heart to more people doesn't diminish existing relationships but enriches them. I've learned that family is expansive rather than exclusive, that there's always room for one more person at the table if they come with love and good intentions. Rick has changed as well. He's softer somehow, more willing to sit with uncomfortable emotions rather than trying to fix or control everything. The experience of watching Derek threaten our family and being unable to protect Ethan through sheer force of will taught him that some things are beyond our control. All we can do is love fiercely, show up consistently, and trust that the bonds we've built are strong enough to weather any storm. Christine is thriving in ways that seem almost miraculous given where she started. She's in a serious relationship now, the first one since Derek, with a kind man who knows her whole story and loves her anyway. She's excelling in her teaching career, winning awards for her innovative classroom methods. She's in therapy regularly, working through the trauma, learning to separate her past from her present. Most importantly, she's forgiven herself for the choice she made 17 years ago, understanding finally that it was the right choice, the only choice that would have kept Ethan safe. Last month, Christine did something extraordinary. She started speaking publicly about her experience, giving talks at adoption conferences and support groups for birth mothers. She tells her story without shame, explaining how domestic violence led to her adoption decision, how fear for her child's safety outweighed her desire to parent him. She talks about the grief and the healing, about learning to live with an open adoption that started closed. Other women come up to her after these talks, crying, thanking her for putting words to feelings they've carried in silence. She's turning her pain into purpose, helping others navigate the impossible choices she once faced alone. Ethan accompanied her to one of these talks, sitting in the audience as she shared their story. Afterward, he stood up during the question and answer session. Someone had asked Christine if she regretted her decision, if she wished she'd kept her baby despite the danger. Ethan answered before Christine could. "I'm grateful she loved me enough to let me go," he said. His voice was steady, mature beyond his years. "She didn't give me up because she didn't want me. She gave me up because she wanted me to live, to thrive, to have opportunities she couldn't provide while running from a violent man. That's not abandonment. That's sacrifice. That's the deepest kind of love." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, including mine. Rick had his arm around me, both of us so proud of the man our son had become, so grateful that we'd been given the privilege of raising him. This was the resolution we'd never dared hope for when we started this journey, a family expanded rather than fractured, relationships deepened rather than destroyed, healing achieved rather than wounds reopened. Derek remains in prison and will for many years to come. We don't think about him much anymore. He's a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could have been but wasn't. Sometimes Ethan gets letters from him, forwarded through the prison system, rambling messages about paternal rights and injustice. Ethan doesn't read them anymore. He did at first, trying to understand the man whose DNA he carries, but eventually realized there was nothing to understand. Derek is broken in ways that can't be fixed, dangerous in ways that required permanent removal from society. That's not Ethan's burden to carry. What Ethan carries instead is the knowledge that he is deeply loved by multiple families, that his existence has brought joy to many people, that his story is ultimately one of triumph over tragedy. He knows where he comes from, both the light and the dark parts. He knows who he is and who he wants to become. That's all any parent can hope to give their child, biological or adoptive. The truth, the tools, and the unconditional love to face whatever comes next. Our story doesn't have a neat ending because it's not over. It continues to evolve as Ethan grows, as relationships deepen, as we all move forward from the fear that once dominated our lives. But if I had to summarize what we learned, it would be this. Family is not defined by biology alone. Love is not a finite resource. The hardest choices are sometimes the most loving ones. And the truth, no matter how frightening, is always better than living in the shadow of secrets and lies. Ethan wanted to find his birth parents, and what we discovered made us realize why he was given up. Not because he wasn't wanted, but because he was wanted so desperately that his birth mother was willing to break her own heart to ensure his safety. That's a gift beyond measure, one we honor every day by loving him with everything we have and by welcoming Christine into the family she helped create. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.